and welcome back to Literally Literary. Happy 50th episode, and thanks to all our listeners for helping us reach over 3,000 plays. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are continuing our discussion on Some Are Always Hungry by Jihyun Yun. Today, we will be focusing on our favorites from the second half of the collection.
So welcome back, everyone. It is indeed our 50th episode, and so we want to, mark the occasion by finishing this great poetry collection and looking ahead to what we have for Black History Month. Concrete Rose is the prequel to Hate You Give. And so we'll be having a giveaway for y'all. So just keep an eye out for that on our social media. I am, of course, your co-host, George Gomez, and I'll let my friends and co-hosts introduce themselves for some of you who might be new to this.
Hi, my name's Vanessa. I'm currently an undergraduate student majoring in English and American Literature at the University of Texas at El Paso.
And I'm Richie Marufo. I love books. I'm a self-described literary activist and enthusiast, and I support all sorts of literary projects on the borderland, including this podcast. And I love reading and talking books with cool peeps like Jorge and Vanessa here. So good to have you guys listening in.
Yeah, it's good to have everyone here. And I know many of you are joining in, as teachers and colleagues. We as usual, we have a lot of things to say about this particular book that we've been talking about for the past couple episodes. And today we are going to finish it. I think one of the things that I was telling y'all that I noticed is how intertextual this collection is. The poems talk to each other, and I was trying to remember, a work that was kind of like that, and I was thinking of Grise's collection. I don't know what you guys think, but it did remind me of like that kind of sequencing and the structure behind it.
Yeah, I would agree that they're like very similar and that the poems are all very connected and that the themes overlap and kind of like expand on the ideas that were like previously mentioned.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of intertextuality within the collection itself. That very much does remind me of Grise's collection, and we may have alluded to it in previous episodes, but it just makes it for a great cohesive read, because there are poems that you feel are referenced in earlier poems and later poems referencing, one another. And there's some metatextual elements, right? Where it feels like, author speaking as poet, because, sometimes we try not to conflate the two, like the speaker of the poem and the author, but it seems like sometimes there's little moments where that's broken and it's like, oh, okay, she's talking to us, or she's like talking to the work. But yes, a lot of the themes that we've been discussing since episode 1 definitely run through as well very nicely. I always like to describe it as the literary thread, that kind of weaves in and out of the collection.
Yeah. And maybe like a vein this time, that just runs across this entire work. And, where we left off, kind of apropos, but it was right at blood type, and, blood is one of the clear symbols in the whole collection. I know you, Vanessa, mentioned Lilith, right? The one right after 35.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you wanted to get us started with that one.
Sure. So I really found this one interesting because we talked a little bit about like I guess war, I guess is what I was thinking of. And so I think it's really interesting to see like little snippets of the war in this one. Because so one thing that I noticed was it says Revelations dog tag. So immediately I thought this is a Christian soldier.
Mhm.
And just the way that he is towards this woman, I feel like that was like this is a very common thing that happens when soldiers go to like other nations. They kind of like take advantage of the women, I think.
Mhm.
That's why this one really stood out to me.
Right, like in Yellow Fever, I think she kind of brings up, it's a concept of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea of benediction as well, going back to the intertextuality, right? um there's a poem a little later, on 48, benediction as distinct cuisine. um so yeah, I think, to me, this is one of the things that stands out about this collection, is just how cohesive it is.
Mm-hmm.
Richie, I know you had a strong line from this one, right?
We're talking about blood type,
No,
or which one?
Lilith.
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought we were jumping around.
Oh,
Yeah, let me go back to it, because I was jumping around. I was cheating and looking ahead. I thought it was a great piece. Lilith as a figure, I think is well chosen, as opposed to, like, say, Eve. And you know so she's kind of been like I think in literature, just I think an interesting, like, counter figure.
mm,
But what the discussion at the end is kind of, again, run through, and it's been discussed here, is like this last line that I think hits particularly strong, and kind of echoes, with the theme of hunger throughout the book. And again, different kinds of hunger, in this case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dear God of man's waste, I know I'll leave this place hungry.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot packed up in this small little stanza of a poem, like paragraph of a poem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like you said, the title, the my- mythological figure there, it does make it kind of an interesting way of teaching students about, the humanities and mythology. Um, if they want to connect it, like you said, to Eden, and scripture, or the Bible, I should say. Um, like you were saying, Vanessa, right? The image of the Revelations dog tag, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, also brings to mind like kind of apocalyptic imagery of, like you said, with war and blood and destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I had the one right after this one, Husband Stitch on 36. And one of the things that stood out to me, and we talked about this the first episode, is that, and if you haven't listened to our first episode, so one of the things we talked about is Yon's use of epigraphs. And the epigraphs that she uses are very diverse. This one is from this text, identified as Transactions of the Texas State Medical Association. And it gives us the explanation of the title, referring to a time when a woman, identified as a married lady, had a ruptured perineum, which is part of the of a person's groin area. And you know uh, the husband tells the doctor, can't you take another stitch? And he did, we're told, and hence the name. um and so, one of the things that stood out to me about this particular poem is, there's that anaphora, Richie, that you identified in the first episode of, in this case, you will improve the woman's well-being. um and it's kind of interesting how that is kind of phrased and placed. So in parts, it is represented in full, and in another parts, particularly at the end, it's kind of split apart or it's incomplete. And so it's an interesting way it's an interesting use of anaphora. And in this case, it uses the epigraph to construct a poem from it. So it talks about the perineum again, in a more poetic form, of course, by saying, I willed it so, pearl thread through her perineum, tenderly I tucked into that rain, ravaged terrain, pulled taut these walls for her own sake, which is synonymous with her husband's girlish aperture I loved. And it goes on here. And it ends with, the, that, forget what it's called in philosophy when, speech act, of I do, I do, I do, I do. But the way that the poem phrase represents that, it becomes more of a, almost like something where the woman has no choice, right? And certainly one of the recurring themes of this collection is how women are raped or abused, placed in these circumstances where they have no choice. And so it's an interesting use of that. And again, all from that actual, technical document in the epigraph.
Yeah, I love again, you're called to, like you're mentioning the anaphora, and really the way the poem is placed on the page, and I think capturing a little bit of the horror of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you what, I would love to hear her read this poem out loud. I feel like that's an element that should be there too.
Yeah.
The way it's here on the page and written out. I think there's exclamations here, and I would love to see the way she reads it, the rhythm, the way words and phrases are broken up, and exaltations.
Yeah, that's a good point. The punctuation, it definitely makes it even more complex, and the spacing of some of the in some of the lines between the words too. So
Like it's stitched up.
Yeah.
Even with the use of dashes.
Yeah. True.
I hadn't heard about this husband stitch.
Yeah, I mean, when I first read it, it kind of reminded me a little bit of Yellow Wallpaper, and maybe like, the kinds of treatments that women would get, and like the rescue at the time, and but yeah. Which poem did y'all have next? I think one of you had caught, but I don't know if one of you had the one on 38, the tale of Yanghua and sorry, I'm butchering the name here, but Hungarian.
Well, I mean, I can say some stuff about this one. I like the flower imagery in this one, and how both her and her sister are represented as flowers. And towards the end, she starts talking to her sister. So I really like in the, I guess, fourth stanza.
Yeah. Is there a particular strong line from that? The stanza, you mean that is all represented where it's italicized and spaced out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I really like the last line where she says, well, the last, I guess, 3 lines where she says, "Dear sister, I am ready to bloom as I am." To me, that kind of said like she's ready to like grow from like even having experienced traumas. Like she's still ready to like live. Like she's ready to live now.
Yeah, and I also liked in this particular stanza, the I thought of narcissists because of what
Oh
it
yeah.
says here. I merely saw your mother reflected in the water and bent to embrace her.
Mm.
Um, and except in this case, it is more of a longing, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to an inner kind of narcissism, of course, right? Um, but that's what came to mind. And now that you mentioned Lilith, Richie, I'm kind of thinking about the use of mythology in this collection as a whole.
Good point. Yeah. I'm just kind of remembering some of the nature of this poem now that we're on here, and
Yeah.
again, just kind of like the emphasis on the transition from girl to quote unquote
Mm-hmm.
womanhood,
Mm-hmm.
and seen as also a moment of fear, because even the father, right, kind of begs in the very first
Mm.
stanza, sweet daughter, stay young a while. Of course, this doesn't happen, right? And um, even though you have like now it's transition from mother to stepmother, she's still kind of trying to like protect her, right? Like it's a it's an interesting thing where they um make him think that she's miscarried.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I'd forgotten about
Mm.
this, and I just remember that again how visceral at times this collection gets.
Yeah, and then again in the second stanza, right? There's the repeated imagery of the blood, and like you mentioned, the miscarriage in that third stanza, um, and the more spring-like imagery in the first and at the end, in the first stanza and at the end. Um, so yeah, I mean it's almost like the whole cycle here, and reproduction, um, or the generational thing, um, and it's the I was thinking about the title too, because it's kind of, I guess you could call it a pun, because the name kind of sounds like the word hungry in English.
Yeah, yeah, good pointing that out. I was thinking it sounded similar.
Yeah. What about cuts on page 40? Um, I think we talked about this one pre-show, right? About how if we want to teach students about, looking at pairing up poems that are similar, or that, like you said, Richie, talk to each other. Um, what do you guys think about this one?
Mm. I think she did a really good job of like portraying, I think, the emotions that a girl would have after having been raped, I guess. Um, like this questioning of like, well, maybe I did want it kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or like the trauma of it, like just like I guess,
Yeah.
mm, I want to say aggressive.
What stood out to me about Ka also is, I think you mentioned it briefly, Vanessa, but the memory, right? And
Mhm.
how memory affects you, one, and particularly for this girl who was only 19, right, when she was raped. And so I like the very ends. I think it's all one long stanza, but the spacing of the poem makes it so that they're almost separated from each other. But it says
Mm.
here, if my memory of that night reflects its image like a convex mirror, then is memory wrong when it says I said no only once? Um, and so, it's just an interesting way of thinking about the how those kinds of traumatic events, our memory becomes unreliable,
Mhm.
and you know there's the reliving of that moment, right? That in itself, I think, this notion of a convex mirror, and questioning yourself about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now, we can go into it's like you said, it's second part, menstruation triptych on page 43, which itself has um, 3 parts to it.
You had mentioned the first part of this one, right, Vanessa? We did to it earlier, a pre-show.
Oh, I just mentioned how they're connected, and well, in the first stanza, she's talking about the speaker's talking about getting their period. So I think that that's interesting following Caught, just because like she was raped, and now like the first line in the next poem is happy to be bleeding. So she's like relieved that she's not pregnant from having been raped.
Yeah, that's I mean, the whole 3 together, right? As again, as triptych, a work of these working together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like the second part, I think it's interesting how it kind of zooms out a little bit, I guess, perspective, and looking maybe at a larger again of womanhood and culturally, I guess, or I guess expectations. So that first line kind of sets it up. She's never wanted to mother, though the world demands from her nothing else. And just kind of going through that whole experience, thinking about, how even menstruation is treated like, for many, it's like just taboo, where it's not talked about, even to the point where she uses this as an example of a girl who kills herself because she thought it was a fatal illness. And in that stanza, I think one of my strong lines that I underlined was, in a world of men, this is the cost of blood. Why let girls bleed without telling them what it means? Why bloody your hands on another's bloody body journey? I think part 3, she kind of hits like these nice stanzas of poetry. In particular, I just think when dealing with trauma and experiencing things, I guess I kind of like the way she decides to relay this. And again, you kind of get back to floral imagery, like a flower is being floral and blooming, and so I think the stanza I highlighted that I think was, her, how people deal with it, and sometimes just hits you unexpectedly. Is the stanza that starts with "I understand," middle of the page on page 45. I understand. The organic green tangle I am also blooms best under moonlight. 6 moons from now, I won't be here anymore. I'll be in New York, scalding my tongue on diner coffee, spitting the grinds on my plate of eggs scraped immaculate. I'll be drunk and happy on 32nd Street. I'll be 23. I'll finally understand all he did to me. It's I like the way she uses time here, of saying I will be here, speaking in the past but saying I will be here. And just the description here, I think is well done. I really enjoy reading it, but I mean, more so even just the horror of, I think, her coming to try and understand what happened to her a little better, because it's something that you do have to process, and reviewing phrases like "I tore you badly" and thinking about how it affected her. It's pretty gruesome,
Yeah, and I think like we were saying about the intertextuality, not just I think the Kant, the poem right before it, but of course there's other poems that do bring to mind that kind of male figure, and and I say male, right, because he is identified as a he. But yeah, I think that the use of italics is also interesting throughout the collection, where you get that dialogue or monologue that does let you kind of see the like I said, the vein that runs across the collection, where there's you could say that there's recurring characters here. The poem right after is where the collection, the name of the collection comes from. Some Are Always Hungry on page 46 is a poem comprised of 3 stanzas. And, like the first poem that I think we had talked about, all female. This poem also references, food and chickens, generations. What did y'all think of this one?
Well, my favorite stanza was the last one. It says, I hate to watch her eat, the way she squalls like one, just discovering plenty, and fearing she will never trust it. I that one really stood out to me just because, like, thinking of people who live in poverty, they don't always have food, and sometimes they have to go days without eating, and just like when they do have food, they eat it as fast as they can. I think because a lot of times it leads to like a trauma of like, I have to eat it now or I won't have anything to eat for a long time, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that one really stood out to me for that reason.
Yeah, I like the call to the generations, and in that same vein, right? Speaking of your vein throughout the text, it reminds me of the hunger that Vanessa just described, and also described in the earlier poem, Passage 1951, where it's the young kids running around the war torn country and struggling to survive, looking for food, and that's the kind of hunger that's described here, and it's somewhat repulsing to her, right? She says, or the way it's described, right? She dismantles it like a lover divesting it of skin, and it's very descriptive, right? And just I think the description again is something that isn't pretty, but it's there, right? She talks about the cartilage and muscles and tendons of it all, and she says, I hate to watch her eat. It's that kind of hunger that we've seen. So I of course I love the call to the 3 different generations of women table and around food. And I do like the way this one kind of works with the following poems as well. But I guess before I move on, you also wanted to say something about this one, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect segue there because I was going to say the first stanza. Again, going back to the arrangement of this collection, which I think, not I think, but again, reminds me of, the way that Grise's collection, the work flowed right, like a river, right? Like the Rio Grande or whatever. And in this one, you get that line, which there's a kind of dark humor in it, right? It's rude to watch the hen's last migration. Her limb passed from empty bowl to empty bowl, body having sated no one. And so, speaking of that migration there, the next poem on 47 is immigration. And so right off the bat, I was just drawn to this one with the title. And it's dedicated, it has a dedication there for SJL. I thought the second stanza, for starters, was really interesting, where it says, an Oriental name will drag her, they say. So she gives up Sonyu for Kafi, though the tongue tip press of the refuses her. And so there's a lot there, about assimilation and how names are mocked, but if they're not, or othered, right? If they're not, part of the mainstream, and there's the kind of the cultural dialectical or linguistic acknowledgement there, right, of the way that they're going to be pronouncing it as well. And then it goes on into the next stanza where it says, she says Catty, or Catty, I guess, for years, and sets even her teachers snickering. the dignity of a name, only the first of things taken. It's barely dawn. So yeah, I just really like that. I think a name is obviously very important. How it's chosen, what it represents. In some cases, the name itself is an inheritance, right? You're a junior or whatever. And in this case, just kind of bringing up the imagery of like, teachers and how teachers can be, right? So yeah, I really like that about this poem. Um, and the second to last stanza I really like as well. I just the line, how to love in a country that teaches surrender. I thought that was a very powerful line too.
Tables heavy with home. I think that's I love that answer.
Yeah.
How do you do it? Well, tables heavy with home, and so it brings a lot of the cultural impact of being able to keep your foods and accept it, which I think is the next poem. Because it's not popular food, but yeah, that's that line that you read, that you started in that stanza is one of my, I guess I call it like the super strong line. Like I don't just underline it, I put stars next to it and stuff, because it's like it fits so well with a titular poem, thematically, right? Again, thinking about food as carrying culture, and then again the discussion of names and language, and how I like the way she describes it through the tongue, right? The name Kathy through the tongue, the tip press of the refuses her. I love that description, but that one line in particular, I just love, because it's what a way to talk about or just capture that essence of maintaining kind of your culture and your ancestry, your ancestral recipes, right? We all talk about it, we all know it, and that food contains culture. So I did absolutely love that one too.
Yeah. And there's that call to pride as well. I like how it's kind of that dedication right from the epigraph. I think of course I can't read the Korean letters here, but I am going to take a wild guess here and say that it's dear, and then the SJL, and then it says be proud of what they try to efface. So I thought that's a very, again, going back to what you were saying, right, about the intergenerational and yeah, I also hadn't thought about the connection to the next one too that you had mentioned, and then we had talked about, I think, going back to even like the first episode.
Yeah, right. Be proud of what they try to efface, and then boom, you turn the page and you have this poem, benediction as disdained cuisine. It is one of my favorites. There's so many strong pieces, but I just really love how this comes together. And again, I think maybe it's also one of my favorites because I think it translates so well to like an oratory performance. And it reminds me of almost like that kind of biblical giving that benediction, give me now, give like that repetition of like a mantra, give me this, like and more so just again taking pride in that food that maybe other cultures would mock, especially I think this is very common in immigrant in literature of immigration and generational, I guess, intergenerational tales of immigration, right? Where oftentimes food does not match where the place where they've moved, and so like in the US you see it is not American food, and because of that it's not as maybe presented a certain way. It's maybe a little bit more raw and a little bit more work involved, and like again the muscles and tendons, all these things that maybe are cut out or left out of like the presentation of a nice meal. And so oftentimes it's mocked, and so it's like a reclaiming of it, right? Where she's saying it like, give me now what scalds and reeks, and just it's fun to read out loud. first of all.
Mhm.
And I mean those lines of her literally saying, "Give me now what disgusts." Food that makes you honor what was killed for your sake. I love that line. And then again, another super strong line. That's what I'm calling them, the ones with stars. It's on the second page on 49. What makes you clasp your palms to your nose is the bell that calls in my hunger. Oh, I love that, you know, because it's a call to the senses, and not that, but it's almost like that classical training as well, right? The bell that calls in hunger. And then finally, you know, it's calling the attention the types of hunger and foods that we've talked about in previous poems. Famine food, food made to last, to transform our seasons, to survive other nations. Give me all I avoided for so long for your sake. I kind of just love the power in this piece
Yeah.
of her choosing to accept these parts of the cuisine, of the food, of the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just awesome, Richie, what you're saying. I hadn't thought about the performance element to it, but yeah, I mean, like you're saying, it would be it's definitely one of those poems that has that, like you said, Old Testament feel to it. And you know, like you said, that the way that it uses the imagery of the food, and goes off the title, right? I think we mentioned the ending, right, where it says, "Give me my heritage back. Let me suck meat off the shell of every animal you won't eat. Give me refuse, and I'll make it worthy." And it goes back to what you said, Vanessa, about forget what poem it was that we just covered, where it talks about the how the generational gap of the older generation who had a famine, and because of war, there wasn't much food because of they were impoverished as well, and so there's a kind of talking back to that here, right, of you know w- one person's trash, right, is another person's treasure, as they say. And I think it just it just ties it in all well together.
Yeah, God. So it's the beginning. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. My bad.
No, go
Vanessa.
ahead.
No, I just it just reiterates how we started this episode, like the way this collection has been put together. Like it just hits a pace and a rhythm that works so well. And that's the fun part of reading, right? Getting to experience it like that.
Give me that funk, like it says.
Yep, exactly.
And Vanessa, what were you gonna say? Sorry.
I was just gonna say that my favorite line in the poem was the last one, the one where it says, "Give me all I avoided for so long for your sake." Just because I feel like it ties back into immigration. Just because of the last line in that one, also. Trying to be proud of your own culture rather than like rejecting it because other people don't have the same culture
Right.
necessarily.
Yeah. Like that's also kind of like an element of hunger too, that I kind of want,
Awesome.
that give me represents as it's repeated throughout this piece.
Yeah. And the poem, like you said, is, I mean, the going off the title, right? I mean, it's a benediction, and I kind of also see it like an anthem, because of that anaphora, demanding, or maybe not demanding, but just kind of reclaiming.
Yeah.
So what else did y'all have after this one?
I only had reversal on 65. I don't know if you guys had anything before that.
I had
I'm sure you do.
savaging on 55.
Yeah, I had savaging as well.
Cool. Well, once again, I think I'm just naturally drawn to epigraphs. They're always so tiny, but they can say so much about the work. And in this case, the epigraph explains this this term in biology that's or ethnology, I should say, where it says it's for an animal maiming or killing her own offspring. Though observed in the wild and across various species, it most severely impacts pigs bred in captivity and subject to severe environmental stressors. Um, and so it's kind of like, once again, it Yon brilliantly, takes this kind of technical term, technical concept, technical document, and then makes a poem out of it. So what we have here, I was of course drawn to this environmental issue, and in the poem itself, it talks about this, being an immigrant, right? And the two places here being Oakland or Seoul, so kind of the U.S. or Korea, South Korea, and it says, "I woke having forgotten even your faces, but remembered my hunger. What if this is all I am left with? Memories of my young body rifling through refuse at the US bases, the slow arc of a dust bloodied moon illuminating garbage, animal bones I picked through for their tears of tooth sinew, wads of gum studded with gristle and American spit. We did our best to rinse off the dirt, but that too is sustenance." And I could go on, but I just really love the poem here. Kind of encapsulates a lot of the themes in this collection of immigration, hunger, memory, and how and survival. And so yeah, I think it's a very powerful poem. And tying into that idea of savaging, which I think is an interesting concept in and of itself. At the end of the poem, kind of goes into that a little bit. We've had other poems where the character becomes a pig, right? And so there's kind of this transformation, or is represented as a pig. And it says here, "It was like we already knew it back then. My girl body half transformed into a pig, screeching its pink forfeit." And a little above it, it says in italics, "You weren't raised like this. You weren't raised like this. But in a year, my sister in all her beauty and pride would be dead." So it has that really dark turn to it, which reminds me of Grise's poems too, that have that kind of voltas in them.
Man, I love that last line, "Weeping for all the lives neither of us would live."
Mm.
Since you brought up mythology, especially this episode, I'm looking at this poem differently, and the idea, because you just mentioned it, of transforming into pigs. And I think of the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, you have Odysseus's men who are transformed into pigs by Circe, and it's they forget about home.
Mm.
And that's something that's brought up all throughout these poems, is about home and thinking about home and ancestral home and forgetting about home. So I think that's a possible interesting connection that I'm just picking up on now.
Totally. Yeah, I totally forgot about that. And yeah, there is a lot there of like nostalgia, right? And the exodus, and just being disconnected from home and returning, right? And just kind of, of course, with Odysseus, like no one recognized him. And so there's a lot there, I think, about how you're in this foreign land and you don't feel at home.
One of the beauties of like just rereading pieces is like catching things you may have like maybe not have caught the first time, or you see it a different way. It's like,
Yeah.
right, this could be cool, man.
And then I know you said you had Vanessa, you said you had a reversal, but Richie, did you have one that you wanted to talk about before that, between that, I should say?
I mean, I think I've mentioned it in previous, maybe second episode, but the leaving season is probably the longest poem or one of the longest poems in this entire piece. I don't know if you had
Yeah.
anything from here, but I just have some lines that stood out to me again as thematic, as interesting, or even funny. I like the way she kind of just sets up this date, and she's, I don't know, just her nature of like repelling with this. He's trying to like impress her in these non-impressive ways that I thought was kind of funny. Um, and she kind of has to like stop and think about hurting his ego. I think that was a moment that I thought was kind of interesting. Um,
Mm.
but there's a couple other moments that stand out to me in it. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, kind of like a meta textual part where, what stanza is it?
On
Yeah, this
62, I think.
yeah, it's a long one, but yeah, on the bottom of 62, right? Did you have that one?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Do not be tricked. None of this means shit. Why do we wish to force narrative after every end? This is only the poet's projection that the severed head misses nothing. The girl doesn't leave the cell safely. As for the pig, she remains dead. So I mean, what do you think about that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I am not one to cringe at the meta narratives, and in this case, I think it definitely works for me. I think it's refreshing, to me, because this collection is heavy, just like Risa's collection, just like Sabrina and Karina. Um, and I think it's nice to kind of get that authorial voice in here, and kind of you know take us out of the moment a little bit.
Yeah, and there's also that image of the end of, because at the end of the story, I walk into the sea, and it
Mhm.
chooses not to drown me. That I think is beautiful, but also recalls I think the first episode when we were talking about the cover,
Mm.
see this woman kind of looking out into this blue, and it kind of makes me think of this part of the poem a little bit.
Yeah, and I had mentioned that I connected this to Nine Inch Nails and their Fragile record, concept album, and came right after. I think most people are familiar with Downward Spiral, but I personally really like the Fragile, and it's got a couple songs, La Mer and The Great Below, that kind of reference that idea. Um, and I think there was another poem too that kind of referenced that sacrifice, or the sea in this way. But yeah, I mean, the endings in this collection as a whole, I think, really really work well on just closing that poem. Vanessa, what about the next one that you had?
So I really like this one because it's kind of like a recipe, which we've seen earlier in the collection, but it's going backwards. Um, I also thought of this kind of as like, because the last line in the poem says, "Dear reader, I so want to survive this. Please lead me whole into another season, so I may dare begin again." And so I kind of thought like this reversal of trauma, like trying to go back to who you were before it all happened.
Mm.
Um, and I just thought it was really interesting how she does it through going backwards in a recipe kind of thing.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And again, just like you were saying, Richie, there's that poetic voice, right, that comes out. Um,
Yeah, this one is killer.
Mm-hmm.
I would also love to read this one out loud, just because there's these cool phrases like unshred, unsinged, de-Korean the
Mm-hmm.
broth, commit yourself to this unharvest, to the joy of unmaking, seek the sow and unslaughter her. Like, damn, this
Mm-hmm.
kind of like poetic power to kind of do reality warping imagery, you know,
mhm.
that is only so visual, that you can see in your head. And
Yeah, I mean, to me, it kind of just brings to mind, the VHS, right, and just hitting rewind on that. Um, and
What is this ancient technology you speak of? VHS?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's vintage now, but yeah, I think going back to what you were saying, Vanessa, about the how it's in kind of an unrecipe, right? It reminds me a lot of now that I think about it, Lewis Carroll, right? And he was big on puns and puzzles. And he had this idea of unbirthdays and um
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think it definitely pulls it off. And I like it also from a physics perspective of thinking about entropy and how the poem here is kind of trying to break the laws of physics, right? By there's a lot of eggs that are referenced in this collection, and they always say you can't unbreak an egg, but it's what this poem is trying to do here. um and so it becomes a ritual unto itself, that an incantation almost, right? Because it's addressing the reader, right? It says, now address the spines, pick them out, right? So it's commanding you to do so. It has that McCarthyian language to it of like, like he writes in Blood Meridian, see the child, where you are part of the poem now. And so that's another thing I really like about it. It would be interesting closing this collection with this poem, but uh, likewise interesting, I think, is the poem that it does close with, that is right after it, Grandmother Praying. Um, I think going back to the very first poem, and I think you had another connection, Richie, that you mentioned pre-show. Um, but the grandmother, right? This recurring character and figure. Um, what did you all think of this one as a closing poem?
I mean, I didn't really have anything to say about this one, but I can look to see.
Well, what about yeah, like what did you think, Vanessa, about the last stanza? And if we think about the last stanza also as maybe the closing lines of this collection too.
Hmm. Um, I think it really ties into the whole collection, and more so the idea of like culture. So her grandmother was leaving Korea, um, fleeing from like the war. I think like the last line even, it says, "Rejoice, for there are no burning cities waiting to inherit them." Like her grandmother is like really thankful that like the newer generations aren't going to have to experience the same things that she had to experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's really important considering like all of the trauma and everything that like is revealed throughout the collection.
Totally. It goes into the generational sacrifice, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
the older generation makes those sacrifices so that the new generation not can afford or have the privilege of not having that thrust upon them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, different. They don't inherit those kinds of problems, or shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love the way that again, the way the collection ramps up to, you can tell it's kind of setting up for an ending. And then of course there is a cyclical nature, because for a collection that starts with a piece entitled All Female,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you have like this grandmother voice and a prayer, which is I think pretty referenced, because you see a lot of biblical references all throughout the book. And it's just,
Mm-hmm.
having that blessing and that wish at the end. And of course, one thing that strikes me is just the dialogue. And it's almost like I talked about this with you guys in the pre-show, but it's almost like you get a response to an earlier question in the book. And I wrote it down here, page 11, right? Well, here in Grandmother Praying, you have this line here at the bottom of page 66. It says, "No, I do not resent you," which, to me, I do remember the question on page, well, it's not even a question. It's a the wish on page 11, because it's field notes from my grandparents. And at the bottom of that first stanza, I did reference this in an earlier episode in part 2. Right. It says, it ends with, "Please say," oh, sorry. "When I fled without returning you to earth, you did not resent me. Please say it. You did not resent me." It's not even a question. It's again, a wish, just like, "Give me." In the other poem we just looked at, here, I think there's some sort of closure in it, right? At the end of the book, "No, I do not resent you." And then it ends with that last stanza, which is freaking beautiful. It's that hope, that hope that we get to end the book with.
And as well, that the viscera and bone, right? So it goes back to what we're made of. And so, and the collection as a whole, referencing so many parts of the body, right? Whether it's our body or the bodies of other animals. Yeah, but yeah, those are all really good points, Richie. One thing I really love as a teacher, those who are teachers out there, is talking to students about these connections, right, that they sometimes might not perceive because they're like embedded right deep, and like you made that connection. And so that's again one of the things I really love about this collection is you can pair these poems up, right, whether it's this one with that one you mentioned on page 11, or some of the other pairings that we mentioned, right? Because as a teacher, of course, you might not teach the whole collection, right? But at least you can teach a pair. And, that'll let you talk to students about, why, how, there's a kind of, and you remember this, Richie, right? This idea of midrash, right? And how a poem can complete another one, how one work can make another whole. So I really loved that about this collection. Because of that, I think it just is very teachable.
Absolutely. In fact, I just recently had a kind of like a workshop a couple weeks back, and I included some of her poems because it's fresh in my mind, and I wanted to talk about some concepts and themes. So it was just perfect. Like, oh yeah, check this out. And I gave them the link so they can purchase it. And so hopefully, people got something out of that.
Awesome. Well, yeah, to the listeners out there, this concludes our discussion of this collection. But like Vanessa said in our intro, we're going to continue with the next book for Black History Month. And like I said at the beginning is, keep an eye out on social media for an announcement of a giveaway of that book, Concrete Rose. We're going to have a reading as well. So that's how the giveaway is actually going to work. So hopefully y'all can attend. It'll be on Zoom, and we'll post the link to it on our social media. And it'll be an opportunity to honor Black History Month. Write a little bit of your own if you like, but of course you could also just read from Black author, poet, activist, what have you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, brought to you by Border Census and Power at the Pass. This episode we discussed Some Are Always Hungry by Jihyun Yun. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode as we begin discussing Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.